Well, look, let me introduce myself. My name's Sid Newton, and we can begin, I think, by a recognition of country, acknowledgement of country, and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the custodians of the land we're meeting on today, and just acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm the Professor of Building in the School of Built Environment and the Director of our Research Centre, and so it's particularly encouraging for me to see our researchers engaging with industry and doing industry-based kind of research. We're very proud of the fact that our researchers have a professional expertise and a professional background and are able to enter into those sort of collaborations with industry. It's a very important aspect of what we do. And we have two key focuses within the Research Centre. One is around social justice and the other is around industry transformation. And so we're trying to promote both of those areas with the kinds of research activities we do. And as a school, we cover from construction management, which is my particular area of background, through property economics, through property development, urban planning, and project management. So there's a broad range of skills that we bring to problems. And the report that you're going to hear presented tonight, I think, reflects some of those ranges of interests that we have. So thanks again for coming along. It is a warm welcome. It's a very warm evening. There's a nice group of us. We can have a good discussion after the presentation, and I'll pass on to Ben, I think, is it? Oh, yeah. Great. Thanks for coming.
Do you want me to mic up?
Yes. Speak to the TV.
Have to be put in your pocket. Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Sid. Thanks, Lois. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's going to be, I think, an interesting discussion to hear about Lois's research on the built form. One of the things in retirement living is that there is not enough research, not enough data to support investment decisions and the advocacy that we do with government. And whenever Lois comes to us and talks about research projects, we jump at the opportunity to work with her and support her however we can, because what she is doing is incredibly important for the industry. And in many ways, I think Lois is quite unique in my experience in retirement living, because not only is she someone who has an interest in retirement living, she is actively engaged with the people who are making investment decisions, the operators, those who are informing and guiding the future of the industry. So when you talk about relationships and partnerships with industry, Lois is absolutely a living embodiment of the way that research, universities and academia can work with industry to drive better outcomes, to understand what industry is doing and to help industry do what it's doing better. So Lois, for that alone, thank you very much, and I think that deserves a round of applause. It's definitely an exciting time in retirement living. It's an industry that in many ways is quite new in the history of humans on this planet. And when you think about it, it's only been in the last 100 years or so that as humans we've had an ability to grow old beyond our working years, and perhaps a much shorter period of time where we've actually had the wealth to look at living outside the family unit and living in purpose-built, age-friendly communities. So much of what's happening in the industry is pioneering, and so much of what's happening in the industry in Australia is leading the way globally. As an industry in Australia, we don't often talk up the great things that we do, and we don't often tell our stories well. And that's because we have been busy doing and not necessarily busy collecting the data, thinking about what we're doing and what we need to do. And Lois's work really adds to that knowledge, helps us, and will contribute significantly to the advocacy that we need to do with governments to tell the story of the importance of age-friendly communities. One of the things that stood out for me in Lois's paper was not only that it's difficult to tell a simple story, but that there is a very clear importance of age-friendly communities and what is going on in age-friendly communities. It's not just about the unit of accommodation, it's about the community facilities, it's about the thoughtfulness that goes into the design and the ability to deliver care in that setting and deliver in a setting where the building is actually being built for the long term, not just for a sales period. And I saw that particularly when I was looking at the bedroom configurations and residential developers building for a market that exists today and retirement living developers building for a market that exists over the life cycle of the development. So there's lots to unpack in Lois's work, and I'm sure we're going to get an opportunity to do that tonight. But I think there's so much of an opportunity to build on this research, and I look forward to working with Lois and Sid and UTS to see how we can do that, how we can encourage more people to follow in Lois's path and to help us as an industry learn more about what we're doing, learn how to tell our story better, and to ensure that we're in a really strong position moving forward to deliver quality, age-friendly communities to an ever-growing number of Australians. So Lois, thanks again, and I really look forward to hearing more tonight.
Hand the mic over. Thank you. Now Ben, I'm going to pick you up on a very slight technical point there. The Romans invented retirement villages. In other words, what have the Romans done for us? They invented them. So yes, they actually had them for the retired legionnaires after they'd done their Legion of Service, and if they survived to the end, they had to go and live somewhere, and that's where they went. So they basically, they did have a type of retirement village. So sorry to pick you up on a technical point there.
It's only out by a few centuries.
Oh yes, yes.
Was it a DMF model?
I'd have to go and consult my notes on that one. Thank you very much. Very good question from the gentleman up the back. Yes, so basically this project came about of comparing, there's some name tags up the back. Basically this came out to compare the built form outcomes. You may be familiar with other projects that I've done, particularly looking at the operational side of things. This one actually looks at the built form, the actual physical thing that is basically physical property that exists once a retirement village or residential development has been constructed. Now, the bit of background to it is that it's a collaborative. The PCA provided access to their villages database, and they helped me with a bit of other information as well. And really what it came out with was when I was doing my PhD research, I managed to interview a couple of planners, and one of them just sat there and eyeballed me and said, I'm basically sick of retirement village operators whinging that they need to get a density bonus. He said, I've yet to see any evidence-based research that there is any difference between a retirement village and basically a residential development. And of course, that's a red flag to me, because I said, well, if there isn't any information, it needs to be got out there. And that's really where it came from, that comment made from a planner saying, look, we need to know this. You people are lobbying this. You people are arguing this point. Therefore, produce some research, and we'll basically come along with that one. And the aim is to compare basically what is built, as I said, the built form between the two. And really the main findings, there's really four main findings that we came out, we looked at this. There's the size of the apartments, the efficiency ratio, that is how efficient the development is in terms of a ratio of apartment or living area of apartments compared to the total gross floor area. Car parking was an interesting one, I thought was, yes, definitely interesting. And floor height I live in a vintage Meriton apartment. It's very cost effective and very accessible to the city, but I can assure you the floor to ceiling height is not very high, and I can actually touch it given my height. The corridors aren't that wide either. So that gives you an indication of the residential developments and retirement villages. And really to sort of talk to what came out with is, I always remember Lynn Chenoweth, she gave out with a wonderful comment about some piece of research she did, which was on dementia and retirement villages. And the subtitle of the title was "It All Depends." And really that's what we find with retirement villages, with aged care, all that. There's lots of nuances. You can't just say, oh, this is the case and that's obvious. There's lots of things behind it. So there's a certain element of, yes, it shows something, but it also says, well, okay, it tells us there's a bit more detail in this behind all these sort of things that we've managed to find. Now, I can just jump in there. Based on 6 case studies, I always thought I was going to start off, I was going to do massive, it's always with anything, I'll do a massive project. It came down to 6 case studies because of the second point, publicly available information. Essentially, I needed to find out properties that had been recently completed, post 2017, where there was both a retirement village that was medium to or higher density, medium density, and a residential development. So I had to have 2 of them in close proximity, ideally in the same suburb. Adjacent suburbs, okay, but they had to be in the same LGA. So that's when I sort of said, right, that gives you a basis of comparison of the 2. Queensland and New South Wales are the only LGAs where they put all the details, the plans on their council websites. And that was where I had got the information. Unfortunately, I went looking in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia and found, yes, there was details that aren't, but you actually had to go to the council offices, apply in person, and basically they might think of giving you the documents. That kind of ruled that one out. So basically, this information was available online, publicly available documents for the buildings, etc. And I said there was basically 6 in total. And as I said, the criteria was they had to be fairly similar, fairly proximate, and recently constructed. And I'm really comparing on a like for like. And this is where we sort of get into a few other little bits of details. And I'm just going to refer to my notes here because I can never remember all of them. Of the 6, the Sutherland and the Sutherland properties, they were both, the retirement village was 2 towers, the residential development was 4 towers. So again, similar, but not identical. Waitara and Asquith, Waitara was a single tower, but it was part of a campus located one and was co-located. Sorry, the Sutherland property was also co-located with residential aged care. And the residential was a single tower. So you can start seeing there's a slight difference between the 2. Yes, they're medium density, but there's other differences. Lutwich were both single towers, and Wollongabba, thank you. You can tell I'm not from Queensland, although I did live far north Queensland for a while. That was 3 towers, and they were campus and they were co-located, and the residential was a single tower. The Pelican Waters, Kings Beach, they were both single towers, as was the Balinga and the Coolangatta ones. So you can start seeing, yes, there's some similarities, but again, co-located, yes, it's a medium density tower, but it's part of a campus development. So it starts giving you a bit more of an indication of, yes, we can start comparing it, but is it truly identical? And that's where you start getting a bit of the background, the nuances behind it. So that's really the data and the methods, and I basically looked at all this information and started calculating it out and working out where the comparisons were. And the first one is the size of apartments. And if you've downloaded the report, which I've got a link to in the handout, rather than give you pages of data, generally, retirement village apartments are bigger than residential development. Now, that's also nuanced in that a lot of residential development, particularly urban infill development, tends to be what I call commuter crash pads. And we know what they are. I mean, where some of your kids have moved out to them already, or where you started off, except most of us started off in a 1960s walk-up apartment type thing. But you can sort of see the type of apartment developments that you would expect, particularly infill developments. Whereas your retirement villages, again, they're often co-located or they're tower developments. So you can start seeing there's a slight difference. When you start getting to the 2 lifestyle ones, which is your Sunshine Coast and your Gold Coast ones, you start getting lifestyle residential development. particularly when you get residential apartments where people are basically going for, they're planning to, it's not so much a retirement village, we want to go and retire to the Gold Coast, and they're moving into apartment developments there. So you look at the buildings and go, look at what's behind it, who is it appealing to? Similar to the report that I did 2017, where it was the Little Bay property where the surrounding residential was obviously being built for retirees looking to downsize. So that's when you start looking at the comparison. Yes, it's a tower building, but this is who they're appealing to. So you can start seeing there's a bit of a difference. But generally, the retirement village apartments were larger. The big one is the bathrooms. I mean, we all know it, particularly for anybody who's doing a development or they're trying to sell it to retirees, they will take a look at the bathroom and go, okay, how accessible is it? Is it all one level? Is there enough room to manoeuvre? All those types of things. And they can spot a lousily laid out bathroom at 200 paces. Like they can also spot cheap fixtures and finishings and other things as well. Retirees buy the sausage, they don't buy the sizzle. So that's, when you look at it, the accessible bathrooms. And also when you're building a retirement village, you have to assume that not everybody's going to be ultra mobile. There are going to be people who may at some stage need a wheelchair. So having that accessibility built into the bathrooms gives you flexibility across your entire development. So again, the bathrooms are larger. The kitchens also tended to be more accessible and larger. And the overall design, it's sort of like, it was better laid out. The space was usable space. I mean, we've all been into cheap inner city apartments where there's long corridors between the walk, basically the communal area and the apartment. The corridor is within the apartment. It's part of your strata area. We've all seen those ones. Whereas the retirement village apartments, they're all usable space. It's good. It's laid out. The space is appealing, etc. The doorways are also wider. So again, you've got those things behind it. You have to build it for that accessibility level. Now the 2-bedroom, again, that's where the nuance came in, because what was with the retirement village, was one of the case studies. The 2-bedroom apartments some of them only had 1 bathroom, whereas the residential development all had 2 bathrooms. So again, it gets back to the compare like with like. If all the retirement villages where they had 2 bathrooms, they were larger than the residential development. So even when you were comparing like with like, they were generally larger. But you have to drill down behind it to say, what exactly am I comparing? Is it like for like? The 3-bedroom was, as I said, was a bit of an unusual one. There were only 2 of the case studies had 3-bedroom ones, and one was larger and one was smaller. So again, it's one of those ones where the jury's still a bit out on that one. Now, really, when you looked at it, it was the suitability issue. Most of the residential, when you're looking at it, particularly the ones that have been built for investors, basically to be rented out, particularly near railway stations, they're not really suitable for a retiree to look for a forever home in. So when you think about it, it's great for people to move out into. It's great for the first home buyers, etc. They need somewhere to start off with, but it's not really suitable for a retiree to move into. So that's really when you start looking at your size of apartments and just sort of really thinking what is actually driving the difference between the two. Now the next one is the efficiency ratio. Now I'm sorry, this doesn't come up with the magic 15%. I don't confirm the magic 15%, but I don't basically refute it either. And that's the argument that retirement villages should be 15%, have a 15% greater density compared to residential development. And again, it's one of those ones you slightly compare the difference between the two. And really what it is that the retirement villages have additional facilities that aren't part of the apartment area. And they're part of your total gross floor area, they're part of your build cost. So you've got to actually have these, but you haven't got these, basically they're not part of your internal floor area. Your big one is your community facilities. We all know what they are. It's the communal areas, it's the activities room, it's all the community facilities, and even it doesn't include the swimming pool outside and all those other things that you might have in there. So your community facilities is a big one. You may also have offices as well for staff, etc. Those types of things. So you're really big one, because often a lot of your retirement villages, your entire ground floor will be community facilities. Most of the residential developments didn't really have a community facility, particularly if you're selling to investors. Remember that community facilities cost money, expensive community facilities, higher strata levies, eats into their overall profits, etc. The next one was the number of lifts, and this is where we've had comments from people looking for a home to basically retire to. They say, I want 2 lifts, because I've been in buildings when the one lift goes out of order, and if I can't get up and down the stairs, I'm stuck in my apartment. And this was an interesting one. Some of the retirement villages had a greater number of lifts. The ones that were campus-style developments tended to have towers, and they tended to have a single lift. So again, where there are a greater number of lifts, that is where your retirement villages, that require, basically that eats into your efficiency ratio. The wider corridors, as I mentioned. And again, it gets back to that apartment design, that usable living area. I think we've all seen, I said, the residential apartment where you open the door and you walk down this long dark corridor to basically then fans out, and you've sort of got your living area and a studio sort of bedsit type arrangement with one window, which is your daylight. Confession alert, I did tick and flick valuing a number of years ago, and I've seen places inhabited by hoarders, and yes, they can actually use that tiny corridor for keeping stuff. It's interesting, etc. But you can't sell a retiree a corridor like that inside their apartment. So your actual communal corridors are a greater amount of area. So you can start seeing there that these are all just design features, and a retiree, as I sort of said, most of them will not basically buy off the plan. They want to see the built form. They will go there and look at it and go, right, what does it look like? You know, what does the corridors look like? And, you know, some corridors for apartment buildings, they can look pretty frightening. Whereas a retiree wants to think, oh, yes, I'm going in here and I'm seeing something that basically, you know, welcomes me to my home. So they're all issues, part of your overall statement. So to move to the chart, and that is our example of our efficiency ratio between our two developments, our residential and our retirement village one. Your greatest one was this one here, which was 2 towers, and that was about 17%. Whereas this one from memory, I was thinking it was about 13%. So again, that was 4 towers compared with 2 towers. So again, you can start seeing that's where your differences. And again, this was your case of example where you've got your campus type development comparing it with another type of development. So again, you can start seeing it's when you actually compare the buildings themselves, that starts feeding into how it works. So again, the efficiency ratio, I haven't proved it. To be bluntly honest, I would say it's actually probably worthy of a decent research paper where somebody can get access to all the architectural drawings. So maybe if some architect's looking to do a master's or PhD project, maybe we should get them to talk to the research people here. That would make an ideal project to start being able, if you have got the access to the data, to start being able to compare them and say, really, how do these built forms differ? And can you come up with a better, you know, basically more concrete example? Because I said 6 case studies, not really conclusive, but it does prove that there is a difference between the two. So you can start saying, you know, it doesn't come up with any magic figure, I'm sorry, but it does show that there's definitely, I would say, a need for more research to understand how these two particular property types differ. Now the fun one, the car parking. This is my favourite photo. Yes, that was actually at a retirement village. I can tell you which one it is too. Yes, the car bay with the mobility scooter. You can also see they've got the walking frame at the back of it. Now, the other problem too here is that often the planning is assessed under 2 different planning instruments. Some of them, they were assessed under the same planning instrument. Some of them were assessed under different ones. So the car parking requirements are different. So to then say, oh, there's one's got more car parking than the other, if they're assessed under different instruments, you can't really compare them. Take a name tag and a handout out the back. There's some water there as well. Arthur Kormakidis has entered the room. So you can start seeing it. You can't really sort of compare it. But what I did actually start looking at with the retirement villages is start looking at the car bays and saying, you know, if there was the dimensions put on the car bays, were they any different from the residential development? A lot of cases they were similar. There were cases where retirement villages were distinctly larger and there was more manoeuvring room. So again, when you start thinking of particularly retirees where there's people anticipating driving, you could anticipate then they would probably want more room. Disability parking, yes, there was often more in a retirement village. But again, it gets back to that other factor that if you've got a campus facility that's co-located with aged care, you can anticipate the residents are going to be moving in later, therefore less of them will be driving. So therefore that's another issue that feeds into the car parking. There were a couple of other, you know, interesting ones. The residential developments also did have a couple of really tiny car bays, like that is Mini or Fiat 500 size. You frankly would not be wanting to get anything bigger than that, or maybe the mobility scooter. What you did also find in the basement was a couple of other interesting ones. One had scooter charging stations. You're starting to see in some of the developments having electric vehicle charging stations as well. One of the interesting points with the campus developments, which I think is an interesting one, is that they will actually have the car parking, admittedly with fire doors in between them, so the entire campus is actually linked underground. So that if you get very heavy rainfall or if it's a stinking hot day, you can actually walk from one end to the other without actually going above ground. It also makes it very easy to move someone, because it's often all at the same level, move someone on a stretcher. So you are in that kind of position there. So you notice that with particularly the campus developments that were co-located, they had this ability to actually connect the entire campus underground. So it's like, basically they're all hidden secret passages, except they weren't that hidden. They were all nicely marked out with pedestrian crossings, etc. So yeah, there was some difference on car parking. And it was just one of those, again, another interesting points. The next one was floor height. And this, as I said, it feeds into with particularly residential developments where you've particularly seen very low floor to ceiling heights. And as a generalisation, yes, retirement villages tended to have a higher floor to ceiling height compared to residential development, looking at both your ground floors and your upper floors. In most cases, the retirement village was larger. There was a case of, one of them, they were slightly smaller. But then you can start seeing, yes, again, it gets back to the wider corridors. A low floor to ceiling height just gives you that slightly, it doesn't give you a good ambience as you're walking into your room. And so having that higher floor height is just one of those more attractive factors, features of the development. One of them was actually flood affected, and they had to have a higher floor to ceiling height there. So you can sort of see, I've looked at a number of different points. I went looking for as many as possible within the built form. So rather than looking at the grounds as well, just saying, okay, have a look at the built form and just see where all these points differ, and where and why they are different. So in conclusion, really was the point that I keep making is that these two types of property are designed for two different end users. Retirement villages are designed for basically essentially owner-occupiers who are looking for a forever home. Particularly if you've seen with a number of operators are basically going for the no more moves policy of essentially saying you'll move into my property and you'll be able to get aged care delivered straight to your room. So you move into that room and you don't have to worry about moving out ever again. So they're essentially selling basically an owner-occupier somewhere to live for the rest of their lives, and people are viewing it as that particular type of environment. Again, compared to residential development, you're often selling it to investors who want to worry about people basically renting it and those types of things. So again, it's a completely different end user regarding it. The big ones was the apartments, the accessibility with the apartment size. And the other one too is your community facilities. Basically you don't go and live in a residential apartment to worry about, getting on with your neighbours. Frankly, some of my neighbours that I've had in my building have been particularly interesting, particularly in lockdown. I could give you a few stories about that. So you're not really seeking meaningful social interaction with them, etc. The big point here, and this also builds into the arguments around build to rent as well. Remember, a retirement village operator is building for people to move into, but the retirement village operator is mindful that because technically speaking they still own it, they are still responsible for the operation of the building. In other words, they're going to worry about, okay, do we have to basically, think, the membrane on the roof needs replacing. We should have built that better first up. Those types of issues. Do we have to worry about all these, types of issues like our fire safety and all those ones? They're real issues. When you own the building, you are concerned about those. So you can start seeing retirement village operators very much when they're building a building are looking at the maintenance for the next 20, 30 years, as opposed to a developer who's really looking at the first lot of purchases, and then basically, as soon as it's out of builder's warranty, they're over the hills and far away. I shouldn't be that scathing of residential developers, should I? But it's just one of those factors behind the development type. So really what that basically looks at is you're looking at two distinctly different, yes, they're residential, but they are distinctly different with distinctly different residents in them. So really that's what the points that I wanted to make out of this particular case study. And we were supposed to have a panel discussion, but pretty much everybody decided not to come. And the architects have decided to hide. So I think we're going to suggest we'd have more of a question and answer participation type activity here. So are there any questions?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I appreciate I came in late, but I'm looking at the notes here, you talk about the built form. What do you think the influence will be with the deregulation of the aged care allocated places, given that going forward, the built form of residential aged care standalone may not in fact exist? Do you see that in any way further influencing the retirement village built form?
It is going to affect retirement village operators where they have a co-located. So where they are, basically they're having retirement village and residential aged care or providing the care services in there. It's one of those interesting ones where you've got to get the site. You've got to be mindful of that ability to be able to provide care services into it. I think it's going to be something that a lot of operators who are looking at their types of residents, and pretty much all operators, don't know if anybody else wants to refute it, are looking at a much older cohort going in, particularly late 70s, early 80s. So therefore people are moving in for that much later period of time. The deregulation of aged care, that is going to add another interesting layer in on it, because the way the industry has gone, the larger operators are the ones that are really the most financial and the most in the best position to be able to develop a new facility. So they're going to be looking at their future demand. What you are seeing with some of the aged care operators is they're building, basically their built form is designed to be flexible. So in other words, they can move the interior layout around. They can change configuration of rooms. So it's not like they've got bearing brick walls throughout the entire building. So you're starting to see more flexibility there. So I think what will happen there is they will be more mindful of it. They'll also be more mindful going forward that they may need even more flexibility into their building. I'm involved with an operator. I'm on the board of one, and we're looking at a much older building. You know, it's still perfectly, capable of standing, but again, you've got that factor. Do people want apartments this small in this neighbourhood? Can we reconfigure the internal development to meet what residents want in this particular neighbourhood? So it's building that flexibility in from day one. Because certainly when it was built, people said, this is ideal, this is fabulous, it's perfect for these people. It's not perfect anymore. So I think it's that what it will actually feed into is that ability to be more flexible in your future use of the property. Now, Paul, I'm going to put you in the spot. Paul Burkett, did any of these findings surprise you?
Well, as you said, it's two different comparisons there. So you've got a long-term view and a short-term view. Our developers, it makes it more clear. Your developers want into pre-sales, sell the product and move on. Whereas the operator has got to no pre-sales, it's got to build community facilities. And as you said, there's an interesting point that you made there is we can't sell off the plan. It's very unusual for a retirement operator to sell off the plan. They're very tactile. They want to walk in, they want to have a look at it, and then they'll come back 5 times later, and then they'll make a decision. Again, it's very different compared to your developers. The interesting things, especially as Arthur was sort of touching on there, is our market's ageing, becoming a lot older. And it'd be interesting to see a comparison then of the entry age of your apartment dwellers versus there. And with us, because we've got we haven't got pre-sales and they can, what's the disadvantages for the operator? Because this whole thing is about cost construction. But for us to get funding, we've got to go to the bank, and they go to the bank and says, well, you've got any deposits. Well, the deposits aren't worth anything. After I'm looking at you there. Because we can't take deposits on these here. So this is an impediment for going forward. So yes, there's a lot of things here that brought clarity. What I really want, and to Ben's point there, is data. We need more of this to be able to go to especially governments and banks and say, well, we're not a resi, we're not Harry Trigger, and ourselves here, we've got to build a library, a community centre, a doctor's area, a hairdressing facility. As you said, it takes the ground floor. And we're providing that instead of the community, the local community providing that for those people as well. So again, more things we get like this helps us to be able to promote our services and our ageing population, and to particularly the people who aren't understanding our product or services.
How about you? I'm going to put you in the spot too, Stig.
Yeah, look, I think just an observation, because I think, this is obviously interesting. It sort of supports what we all sort of knew, and I think we need the data, as Paul said, and you saying we need the data here. I think one of the interesting things, I know you don't have the information because you're relying on public information, but even the cost to build, so you obviously talk about not just you have more space, so your efficiency ratios are not as great, but then again, what about the cost, the quality of the build? You're talking about it, operators building for the long term. So not only do you have to build all these, the community facilities, which you don't really get technically paid for, but you are through the, the value of the whole deal, but also the quality that you're building. I think it's good to have data around what does it actually cost per square metre to build a retirement building compared to residential. And I think the comparison there, and actually really promote that, you're actually getting much more in that, not only the community facilities, but also all the specs, the ageing in place features, even emergency call systems, all that sort of stuff that you're building into a village that you're not building in residential adds to the cost. So that's important data, again, when you've got to.
But on that
argue
point,
for it.
Stig, though, is look at all the current issues in Sydney regarding the high-rise towers in terms of quality control. And since we're long-term, to Stig's point, is how much are we actually investing in there and taking the pressure off government? Because these guys aren't going to tick and flick, are they? For us.
No. So yeah, I mean, you're coming up with actually some particularly good ideas. I think Sid's making a few notes here. But certainly, yeah, it's the difference between the two built forms. There's a built form difference, and there's also a difference in the cost. And no, I didn't actually look at that component.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like in doing this type of research, we're actually finding other ways in which we know that we actually need further information, which then gives us a better understanding of how the industry operates and why it is so distinctly different to residential. Now, you gentlemen up the back, I'm going to basically make sure you're not allowed out of the room until you've asked a question, so you better start thinking of one now.
So Wayne, from a builder, do you see any differences between a retirement and a resi guy?
Lois actually asked you, does anything surprise you? One thing that did surprise me is the floor-to-floor differences. Like, we work in both sectors, resi and retirement. And it's not something that stands out to me that we typically go, oh, it's retirement, we need to go a larger floor-to-floor. So that actually surprised me that sort of became a bit of a common theme in the projects you looked at. I'm surprised, I don't see why you need to have a larger floor-to-floor in a retirement to a normal resi project.
Well, if you've got stipulations of ageing in place, etc., so then obviously, your wet areas there become naturally larger.
Oh, no, horrors, I'm not talking about it. Like,
there's no extra services there, is there? So there's
no, you're still fitting in your air conditioning, and obviously your structure's all still the same.
Yeah.
There's a surprising thing we found out.
But is that more light and sort of ambient? Because these people are spending more time in those places as opposed to a resi situation.
Well, you made the comment, maybe because your hallways are a bit wider, that you don't want to have as low a ceiling. If you're wider this way, you need to be a little bit big that way. No, it's interesting. Nothing we talk about with our architects on typical retirement project. The hallways are wider, therefore we need to make our floors.
But then I suppose in the design thing, you're going to Lois's point is, exposed balconies, and then you've got breakdowns of membranes, etc. You think the retirement guy would actually start building a closed-in balcony as opposed to a cheaper alternative. So you've got a different build all the way through.
Yeah, like you guys are holding, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Whereas the residential developer, he's flipping and he's out of there. So
Yeah.
you got 50 resi apartments versus 50 ILUs. He's only going to sell 50 once, so he's got to do 50
That's
sales.
right.
You've got to do 50 times how many times you turn over
Exactly.
in 40, 50 years. You've got to make 500 sales or whatever it might be.
And why would you want to keep adding to your cost with your capital each time besides a refurb?
Yep. You're going to look for the lower maintenance, which obviously
Yep.
puts your initial capital cost a little bit higher, but
Yep.
long-term maintenance is an issue for you.
So maybe that's why you got the ceiling height there. It gives it that, you're sort of future-proofing, not for this generation, might be another 20 years down the track.
People get 12 and 20 years.
Well, more like they want more.
Everything's well
More
shorter,
space.
Well, I mean, they are getting taller. Yeah, people are definitely getting taller. So, sorry, you've got a question up there.
I was going to say, I'm from Lee's current entrepreneur retirement business. It's just a basic for us that you have that minimum floor to ceiling, because people are spending more time in their home, and so it needs to be really a great space and an inviting space, and that's part of also having more space. And we are finding that more people are demanding and interested in 3 bedrooms, interested in 4 is even becoming common, where you might have a couple who each have a room,
A wing.
yeah, their own hobby room each. So, and then if they don't want to sleep together, they've got their own spare room, or a spare guest room as well for people to visit. So I was interested in that in your study, if you had a comparison of the occupancy rates of the building. So the occupancy for the scale of the development, I would imagine, is much lower for retirement living.
I did do that, but I didn't put it in the summary, mainly because it's a bit of a tricky technical one. Basically, I did it on the basis of the density of retirement villages, which is about 1.3 or 1.4 people per apartment. And that tends to come from operators and from discussions with valuers when they actually look at, when they're doing a series of valuations. Though, to you.
Sorry, is that on a new build? Because you know you get a younger entry age with a new build whereas an established as a... Yeah.
That would be as an established valuation of a retirement village. So you'll have, you know, it basically was across the whole gamut of retirement villages. People will move in single, they'll move in as a couple.
As I said, because it's a younger cohort, the new build, you usually get couples. And
Yeah.
older, you usually get singles because it's older.
It probably would be more biased toward an established village.
Right. Yes.
What I did do then within the report, but I didn't put it in this, and I'd have to refer to the report to go to it, was actually look at the population densities on an apartment by apartment basis for the area that they were in. And that's an interesting one, because what you started to find with particularly certain residential areas, the density in residential apartments was much higher. So I went on the ABS data, so it's sort of like number of people per apartment, that type of thing. So you were sort of looking at, say, 2.3, 2.4 people per apartment. Where it suddenly differed when you've got neighbourhoods where there's obviously a lot of vacant properties, where people use it as a sort of like, you know, city second dwelling type thing, and you might find that all people often will have this is ours, you know, particularly around this area, around Haymarket, you'll often find people, they'll have a Sydney property and they come here for, say, 3 months a year, and the rest of the time it's completely vacant. So you will have those areas where you've got those kind of situations, although you may have someone next door where there's 9 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. So that often does tend to weigh it out. So I did do that, and it is in the report, and I'd have to refer to that. But it does give you an idea of the density per apartment in that location. In most cases, the retirement villages, it was a lower population density.
So then what was the car parking? Did you compare the ratio of car parking with resi versus retirement?
No, I said for the same reason they were usually under a different planning code.
Right.
So I said, no, I didn't really, it's because again, if you've got a campus development with residential aged care, your assessment would be quite different to, say, a residential tower.
Yeah, I'm just thinking for, you know, government areas, are you promoting that you've got less cars and more efficient people getting around in retirement versus resi?
Yeah, it's one of those really tricky questions where you can start saying, oh, but they don't need cars as much, etc. We're taking this, etc. You can actually argue that one both ways, particularly if you've got residential aged care, because then you've got to have people to get there. And that's a lovely comment. I've got a research project I feel coming on looking at residential aged care and proximity to public transport, because your staff have got to get there.
Yep.
So when you think about it, those types of things, when you're looking at residential developments, you know, okay, people tend to commute, but when you're looking at co-located facilities, every operator's thinking, well, my aged care staff have got to get here. You know, and if they've got to drive, well, that really limits my employment pool. So they're all other issues that you sort of add those layers into how these properties function as once they're up and operational, and that feeds into the built form as well.
Do you think there's space to bring together affordable housing, residential with retirement to meet that need?
Yes, there's that. I mean, particularly, you're talking about community housing.
Some form, well, not necessarily community, like, I mean, I'm talking making it affordable for your aged care workers and the like to be in an
I think what you've also found, and one thing we've learned in the pandemic, that a lot of aged care workers want to live where their family lives. So asking a lot of these people, I think pretty much every operator with an aged care facility commented that a lot of their workers came from the areas that were in the areas of lockdown. And so you had that situation where the workers basically, they live there because their family lives there. And if they've got a series of people that, they might be working in aged care, but say, with some of the men might be working in a completely different job and they need to be near that location. So you're looking at a situation, it might sort of say, oh, let's put in apartments for our workers. The answer is, well, no, apartment's not suitable because they are part of a family of 5 and 3 of them work in jobs over there. So that's something you've got to really be mindful, particularly when you've got aged care with your employees. They've got to be able to get there and get there conveniently. And where do they come from and what's their background as well? So it's just one of those other layers of issues behind, when you're looking at locations of properties, etc., and how they function once they're up and built. So yeah, there's possibly room for a key worker, but there's all those other issues on top of it as well.
It'll be interesting to see if in 5 or 10 years' time with the working from home stuff that's obviously occurring the last couple of years, and with residential, whether or not that gap will close between retirement, typically larger unit. Now the developers are starting to consider with more working areas within an apartment for a normal resi, because rather than sitting at your kitchen table, you've got some study space or working area. Where those units start to grow and close that gap between a typical resi unit and a retirement living unit. I know I'm doing development for a resi developer in Waitara, and DA's just gone in, and he insisted we included some communal space, not that different to a retirement, where people can come out of their unit but still stay within their unit block, and it's like you have Wi-Fi there, they'll be able to just sit with their laptop in a communal area on the ground floor, and they've got a working area rather than going to an office.
So how's he built that cost in there?
He was happy to take that on because I think that's going to be a selling pitch for him.
So it's a marketing
Employee.
But there's a long-term strata cost to keep it.
Yeah.
To your point about community centres before.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a capital cost and then an ongoing strata cost.
Yeah.
He thinks it's going to be a decent selling point for when he sells the apartments.
I thought I read some Americans coming.
Yeah. Maybe he thinks he's the next Harry.
Yeah, I mean, these are all things, when you look at it, how will the pandemic influence how we demand property? Personally, I think the jury's still out on a few things. I actually came into the office most days throughout the entire pandemic and say that I found it quite enjoyable and quite pleasant, and the mice kept me company. Working from home is not for me. It's not for everybody. Some people enjoy it, particularly if you've got plenty of space. Developers going to he's putting more space in. That also depends upon ability to pay. Certainly in an area that's got a lot of white-collar employees, people who possibly will be working, remotely, etc., that will be a selling point. But again, it ultimately then starts depending on, where are the locations and what type of people are there. So it's boiling down to a lot more of the it all depends types issues.
Those draft guidelines that have been put on the web with the housing sector talk about those extra spaces that can include the corridors and the amenity of buildings, but also if you have an apartment, say that's south facing, then you might have a communal space that's sunny north facing that you can actually use. So it could actually increase the value of some of the lesser value apartments in a building. So there is some sort of shared benefits there that it could lead to. So that's an interesting.
Yeah, these are all things that could be coming in the future. Although knowing what some developers are like, they'll probably be developing to a budget quite happily. So again, extra cost, yes. It's another cost. Are people ready to wear the cost, given that the prices have increased so significantly? Basically, people are more worried about affordability rather than sort of things like do we have an extra room for a study, etc. Which is, again, it gets back to that demographics of things as well, that a lot of people with spare bedrooms and study rooms found working from home relatively easy. But if you didn't have those facilities, you've actually found it quite difficult. So yeah, it's one of those, it's as I said, going forward, it's just, what this has done is shown that there's a difference between the two types. Whether the pandemic significantly affects the built form remains to be seen. We're seeing, small trends reversing, like for example, the move to the regions. People are sort of realising, yeah, it's not that great actually.
As part of your study, did you identify that one of the key things seems to be accessibility requirements, for the larger bathrooms, larger corridors? Was that something you could take out, and that's an obvious difference that there will always be with the older housing that's not required in standard residential?
Yeah, and I think it's basically, it's also trying to sell it to the residents. When you look at a resident, as I said, they know an accessible bathroom at 20 paces, and they'll be able to look at it and go, no, I don't, it just doesn't work. So again, yes, there's, you can sort of see, yes, there's the requirement there, but the residents are demanding it. And they, as I said, when you're looking for a forever home, and you talk to anybody that's moved into what they call their forever home, they sort of said, yeah, you can take me out of here in a box. I can basically, live here forever. I can basically do that. The bathroom will basically accommodate a wheelchair. It's got these facilities and amenities. That's what this place gives to me. So that's really what they're looking for. So you can sort of argue that, you could have differences in building codes, but this is actually something that people demand moving into retirement villages. They want that ability, really that no more moves.
Did you do a comparison with the resi versus a retirement two-bedders? Like, on average, what the difference in each pricing was for each?
You mean the price?
Yeah, so the price for a two-bedroom resi and a two-bedroom retirement?
No, I didn't look at the prices on this one. So I didn't actually look at prices because I didn't. You guys didn't give me access to the prices. No.
Just because when you're talking built form, how does that correlate to resale price?
Yeah, and again, that was something that I didn't look at. Again, I purely looked at the actual built form, rather than actually saying this is the ultimate cost. That then, as I said, it gets back to that the build cost comment. It's actually, this is another layer. We've actually, what this has done is just shown you this is part of the equation.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other layers in there. There's the build cost and there's the actual cost that you can buy, or the selling price to the resident. These are all things that you need to sort of build and factor into your equation there.
That would be interesting to get that comparison.
Yeah, it's something that, But also the other thing is that it also depends on the operator and how they're pitching it to a market. Because you can remember, different operators will pitch it to different markets and they'll pitch to different price
You can package it up, but at the end of the day, they've still got to recoup their investment, and it's got to be a viable build. But we're often competing against, especially you talk in northern Sydney now, you've got a lot more high density places, and they're building near retirement villages. The person coming in goes, well, what's the price difference between the two, and what do I get out of the two different products? Some people are putting inbuilt concierges in their apartment blocks there.
Yeah, I mean, they're putting all sorts of things in, so yes. I mean, but it's also, remember, it's the going in cost, the selling cost. There's also the cost of actually your continuing occupation, your strata levies or your monthly service fees. So again, it says that when you're comparing it, always make sure you're comparing everything.
Yep.
Rather than just sort of say, well, the incoming cost is this. Once you sort of say, it's a bit like a lot of things. Oh, yes, we'll have all these facilities from day one. 3 years down the track, they were saying, well, actually, this is pretty expensive. Why do we need all these facilities? Can we cut corners here? Can we change that there? Those types of things. Yeah. So I think, it's something when you're comparing, yes, but you've got to compare it across the full spectrum. So, no, I didn't do it. Yes, it would be interesting. Perhaps you've got somebody with a bit of free time in your organisation who'd like to do a research project.
Absolutely.
What are you doing next week?
Well, perhaps Lend-Lease has got a few people, they're sitting around doing nothing.
Well, on that point, just what I was looking for is comparing the price. Now that we also have variations in the price in retirement, so people are coming up with no DMF, some DMFs, etc. In your comparison, did that come into your equation?
Yeah, as I said, no, I didn't actually do that comparison. And I mean, essentially what you do if you're going to do that comparison, you do it on a present value with a few assumptions behind it for each resident. But the other thing too is about having your differential pricing is that some people are perfectly willing to forego any you know, basically revenue in the future, because they say, I actually want to move in here and this is all I've got and this will actually give me what I want. And so I'm better off actually paying off a reduced amount up front with a lesser amount in the future. So again, it's actually also basically boils down to what people are prepared to pay for and what their personal situation is. So again, it's one of those really complicated ones. Yes, you could compare it, but you've got to make sure you're comparing two meaningful things. You know, it's rather than, because then you might sort of say, well, if you compare it, then it gets back to the previous project. Well, if you move in there, it's going to cost you, or this, but you get all these other things as well.
So I suppose, did we look at how far a radius that the people are coming from resi versus retirement?
No, again, I didn't do that one.
Wondering how big a pool of retirement versus a resi is? You know, is it a 10k radius around retirement or is it a 5k around resi?
Well, you're the operators. Perhaps you should tell me where your catchment area is.
South East Queensland's always, to my experience, very complicated because they'll come from New Zealand and Adelaide, whereas in Sydney they'll come from 10k's from where they live, where the retirement is. So, yeah. Queensland's an anomaly as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, I mean, I need to actually get the personal data. Sorry, you had a comment to make?
No, sorry, I'm just waiting.
Again, I mean, you guys have got access to the personal data. I have to rely on ABS data.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've got a few projects coming out when the ABS data comes out, and lots of fun to be had, you know, for all of us researchers there, just seeing where people do come from and why they do move.
And how far, you would have that stick in your past life. Those developments.
Yeah, no, we've got the operators got data from where residents are coming from. So
but was it, you know, metro 10k's and then regional further afield?
Yeah, I think it's very, you know, depends location specific as you're talking about. So if you're talking about Sydney, you're talking, you know, I'll even say a lot of areas in Sydney is probably 5k primary catchment, maybe up to 10k's, but obviously as far as we move out to the regions, it gets a bit broader than that. But I think that data, you know, is obviously available. Lots of operators, you can assess that.
Mm. Yeah, just making it publicly available to researchers.
Yeah.
You have a comment?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm interested if you actually check the, this is being facetious, if you check the approval timeframes and which state won out in terms of the fastest.
No,
Which council?
And again, but that also implies that, I mean, like I said, some are part of campus developments.
Yes.
You know, and so again, you start saying, well, there often is a story behind some of these. And so if you don't have that story behind it, one of them, for example, the Sutherland property was actually, I think it was an old local government depot of some kind. So again, you'd have stories behind why this property is there and why it was built there. And you often find that, you know, there's often other deals that get done as part of the overall development. So yeah, it's one of those interesting ones, yes, but no, I didn't do it because you're actually getting, and also when you've only got 6 case studies, you really need a better data pool to come up with something meaningful to say, look, this is going to tell me exactly what the difference between developing your development time between the two types. And I mean, you know, particularly a very vanilla residential development that conforms to all the planning requirements, you might sort of say, well, that's fairly straightforward. Or if you were to convince them for other things behind a retirement village, that naturally is more complicated.
And yours, these all complied with the controls, did they, in terms of what they submitted?
I went on what was finally approved.
Right.
So basically, I didn't actually go through that whole process of how they went through the approval process. So I said, like, basically assume that this is what basically their final approved plans. This is what I basically went on the basis of. Well, I think we're all basically getting to a standstill. Unfortunately, the extensive UTS beverages arrangement is that plastic container that you picked up on the way in. We were going to suggest that we might adjourn to a nearby establishment of which there is a plentiful supply for those who would like to, but I'd really like everybody to thank you for coming. It's certainly been an interesting, informative discussion. And as I said, I always find these conversations always give me ideas for things that I could be looking at. It's one of the advantages of when you are an academic researcher, you're allowed to basically go and look at things that you find interesting and say, well, actually, that's rather interesting. I wish, you know, that sort of tells me something about this, etc. So it's always find these kind of conversations very interesting, and it sort of feeds into future potential research projects. So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.